This is Kelly Forden. Welcome to the fourth year of Let's Deconstruct a Story. This podcast started in July 2020 when I interviewed short story writer and friend Desiree Cooper about her story, Night Coming, from her award-winning short story collection, Know the Mother. Since then, I have talked to oodles of writers about their stories. I was going to add it up, but there are so many. If this is your first time listening to Let's Deconstruct a Story, this is a podcast for the story nerds. Aspiring writers need to understand the components of a good story before they can write one. Choices of POV, plot, setting, and tone are crucial. In each episode, I interview a writer about one of their own stories, which will be available for listeners to read for free on my website, kellyforden.com, before they listen. Except for a brief stint in 2021 when the Grosse Pointe Public Library in Michigan supported the podcast, I have been producing this podcast on my own. In 2023, audio engineer Elliot Bancel started helping, and you probably noticed a big uptick in the sound quality. I'm grateful for donations as I am relying on them for production costs. Thanks to Lisa Kay for her recent donation. It means a lot. Even if a donation is not possible, I'd love it if you would visit my website, kellyforden.com, and sign up for the newsletter. Today's show features Jai Chakrabarti talking about his best American short story, A Small Sacrifice for an Enormous Happiness, which also happens to be the title story of his award-winning collection, published by Knopf in 2023. And now for the show. Well, I love this story so much, and I'm just thrilled to be talking about it. And I guess I wanted to just start out by asking you a little bit about the location and the time period and what's going on historically there, right in the beginning.
Sure. So it's set in 1980 in Kolkata, India. And I was born around that time. And my grandparents' house is a house in northern Kolkata. So this is the part of Kolkata that was particularly settled by the British. So there were a lot of old British buildings in that part of Kolkata. And I found their house to be a source of incredible stories and incredible images. And so part of the impetus for this story was thinking about my grandparents' house and how in that period, in that moment, it was changing. So there was this old house there, and then there were all these kind of new buildings that were cropping up around them. So that's 1980, 80s India.
Okay. And so you were raised in the States and then you would go over and visit, or were you over there? Were you living there at the time?
So I was born in India and I lived there until I was 9 years old. And then after we moved here, I would spend 3 months in India every summer because my parents were teachers.
Okay.
And,
nice.
They would enroll me and my sister in Indian school.
Yeah, the reason I asked is because there's so many amazing scents in the story, smells. And I was just curious as to whether those are so powerful because you didn't experience them all the time, and then you came over and you were overwhelmed by them, or because there's so many, the smells from the wildflower fields, the smell of steel, the smell of sharma, the smell of the night-bound stubble, the smell of the bleary-eyed dairyman of curd and wildflower. I mean, I just thought it was amazing. And I guess from a craft perspective, before we get into the story, is that one of the five senses that comes to you first when you're working? Or was it this particular story that...
It generally is the sense that I am drawn to the most. And of course, there's all this research that connects smell to memory. And I think there's something to what you just said, which is that while I spent 3 months in India every year as I was growing up, I wasn't there full time. And so there was this sense of yearning for parts of that experience when I was living in America. So maybe the smell is connected to the memory of the place and it heightens the way in which I remember certain things. So yeah, that certainly is the sense that I fall back upon most strongly in my fiction.
It's so evocative. I was wondering, I don't always do this, but I was wondering if you could, do you have the story in front of you, if you could read the first paragraph?
From his balcony, Nikhil waited and watched the street as hyacinth braiders tied floral knots, rum sellers hauled bags of ice, and the row of elderly typists, who'd seemed elderly to him since he'd been a boy, struck the last notes of their daily work. Beside him on the balcony, his servant Kanu plucked at the hair that grew from his ears.
Thank you. I'm curious about the elderly typists. That because I was trying to figure that out.
Yeah, so that was a feature of 1980s, even 1990s Kolkata, which is that if you wanted to have something typed up, you would just walk down the street and give the notes, the handwritten notes to the typist, and they would literally be sitting on the street, and then they would produce a document for you. So it's kind of magical in that way. I mean, there would be barbers on the street, dentists on the street, typists on the street. So you could get a lot of your business done just kind of walking down a main thoroughfare.
Oh, that's so cool. I was also drawn to the fact that there's someone there recording everything that's happening. Not that they literally are, but the typists are right there, sort of like the writer is there. And so I'd love to know a little bit about the class difference between Nikhil and Sharma and how that impacts their relationship. They're different locations in the country and in the city.
Sure. So Nikhil is middle class or upper middle class. He is a landlord, so he's managing several buildings and lives in his parents' house. So he's pretty well established in Kolkata. He's not wildly rich, but certainly compared to Sharma, his lover, he is quite rich. And so Sharma lives in the village. And in Kolkata, certainly in that time and even today, folks from the neighboring villages are commuting into the city for work. And then they're commuting all the way back to the village. And so Nikhil, as his patron, becomes a pretty significant source of income for Sharma.
I was thinking about their relationship, and I was trying to get a handle on what Sharma really felt about the relationship. Of course, there's this power differential, and it sounded like he was benefiting a little bit. You know, his house was really nice because he benefited from it monetarily with gifts. And I don't know, it was hard to tell. Like I read it several times and I was thinking, does he love him? Is he ambivalent? So
I think it's hard to tell because we're not in Sharma's point of view. And so I think that's one of the ways in which the story pretty much resists providing a direct answer to that question. My own view is that I think it's complicated. You know, I think that my sense of Sharma is that he is attracted to Nikhil, that there certainly is a strong sense of attraction, and that he's aware of the power dynamic between the two of them, and that he is using it to some extent. And at the same time, he also has this real attraction to Nikhil as well.
Right, because we get a pretty thorough description of Sharma's boy, you know, like what he looked like. He looked like a Bollywood star, and all the women, you know, find him attractive too. Right. But I looked for a description of Nikhil, and there isn't one really.
Yes, there's just a brief mention toward the end of the fact that, you know, he feels old. He's got like a receding hairline or something like that. But yeah, it's just a very brief mention of appearance. And so it is much more about Sharma and the fact that in some ways, Nikhil has objectified him. The story sees Sharma, and because it's through Nikhil's point of view, through his looks. I mean, that is a pretty significant entryway into their relationship.
Yeah. And I noticed he said something about fetishizing the smell of him, the smell of hard work. And so he, in a way, and he doesn't really have an awareness of what danger he's putting Sharma in by coming to his work. Because I don't know the area, I wasn't sure. Would that be dangerous? It sounds like the boys from Kerala. Is that the way you say?
Kerala, yeah, the boys from Kerala who suffered violence. And so it would have been dangerous for them to be openly out. I mean, so not only are they gay men, they are also crossing class boundaries, caste boundaries as well. So it would have been not a great proposition for either of them to be out at the time.
Mm-hmm. And yet Nikhil seems not too worried. Is that because his class protects him, money protects him, and living in the city protects him a little bit?
Yes, I think that he has a number of advantages that Sharma doesn't have. And he has also not had to worry in the same way Sharma has had to worry about the essentials of life. And he's always sort of been taken care of. He's had this servant Ganu, for example. And so, yeah, I think he just feels more of a false sense of security, even though, he surely would face a degree of ostracism and potentially other repercussions if he were to be out at the time.
When you were crafting the story, did you at any time write from Sharma's or try to write from Sharma's perspective as well?
I do, yeah. So when I write most stories or work on novels, I try to write from other characters' point of view. So I keep character journals where I ask characters different questions and just try to get a first person sense of how they might talk, who they are, what their vibe is. So I did that for Sharma, I did that for Nikhil, and for Tripti as well.
Okay. Yeah, tell me a little bit about her. So it sounded like she would not have had many other options. This was a good deal for her. She wasn't very attractive. It didn't sound like she was going to get married otherwise. But you give her a lot of gumption, like she wants to go to university and she's trying to get out of her situation a little bit. How realistic are her goals there? And what do you think she's thinking? Like, what was in the journal about her?
Yeah, well, it's hard to know if she is particularly attractive or not because it's told through Nikhil's point of view. So
Right.
you do get this pretty negative description of her of her appearance, but yeah, maybe it should be taken with a grain of salt. But yes, and she clearly has some aspirations beyond simply being married to Sharma, and we don't have a great deal of insight into who she is and what she really wants. But, I think what is clear is that Nikhil's view of her, which is that she is this docile woman who will take whatever is provided to her, is not the woman that he actually encounters when he goes to the village. Mm-hmm. In terms of how realistic are her expectations, I think it's hard to say, but, I also don't want to believe that she can't rise toward that level of ambition. So I don't know. I feel optimistic about her gumption, so to speak.
Yeah, I hope she makes it. I
Yeah.
mean, not that she's real, but you know what I mean. I was
Yeah.
rooting for her.
Me too.
So Nikhil is interesting too, because obviously he's facing his own kind of prejudice, but he is a little put off when she talks back to him. He's like, well, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. And I find that so fascinating because it was so subtle, and yet it happens in every part of life. Like everybody wants their little bit of power, and they don't want to be demeaned in any way or suffer prejudice. But it's so interesting to me how it seeps out right in other corners of your life.
Totally. And there's something that happens in Bengali that I think is difficult to translate into English, which is that, like other languages, there's sort of the formal Bengali, and then there's the more vernacular common Bengali. And so most of the time, people would be just speaking in the common vernacular Bengali. But if you're, let's say, in a particular situation where the formality is warranted, you might use more of this older formal Bengali. And so Nikhil, he feels so marooned talking to her that he switches into this more formal Bengali to try and get the upper hand because he feels like he's lost so much power in that situation. He wasn't expecting to feel powerless in that moment.
Right. And what does he, when he looks in on the two of them and they're having this quiet night together. Yeah, it was so poignant. And so I just felt terrible for him. And I felt his loneliness in that moment. And it just seemed so unfair. I don't know. It was just very sad. I didn't really have a follow-up question to that, but it's sad.
So what I wanted to wrestle with was this vision of a character who is both vulnerable and privileged at the same time, who is suffering from a lack of self-awareness,
Yes.
and who also wants to engage deeply in these relationships, but doesn't really know how to do it gracefully. And so in that final moment, I think all of those kind of contradictions of his character, his desire to be loved and the way in which he's going about that pursuit run into each other. And we have this moment of loneliness and confusion.
Mm-hmm. So there's a moment where he's visiting, and this is earlier before that, and he sees Sharma as the crowd is thinning out, and he's walking with someone dressed in the atrocious nylon pants that were the fashion. And perhaps they were telling jokes because Sharma was doubled over laughing. In all their evenings together, he couldn't recall seeing Sharma laugh with so little inhibition as now, so little concern about who would hear the joyous voice. And I was wondering is Nikhil jealous when he hears this, or is he thinking that Sharma always has to be so careful around him that he can't relax? Was it a little of both, maybe?
I think he's at first surprised that he's seeing a side of Sharma that he doesn't see every day, even though they have been together for some time. And then I do think he feels a degree of jealousy because that's a side of his lover that he doesn't have access to. And maybe even he feels a sense of confusion as to why that is. Like, why does Sharma not give him that openness, that sense of being at ease?
Mm-hmm. And so Nikhil can't tell he can't have Sharma over to his sister's house. So I got the impression that even though he's privileged and everything, there's no one in his family that knows about this. The only person is
Kanu.
He's the only one who knows. And I wondered, is that Kanu is okay with it because he is a servant and he has been with him for a long time and he loves him, or he has no choice? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. One is that they've been together for a very long time. So Kanu has raised him since he was a little boy.
Right.
Nikhil isn't the kind of family where it would be common for the domestic help, the servant, to actually really raise the child, to be the primary caretaker. And Kanu has this, deep, maybe even it could be called unconditional love for Nikhil. But I think there's something else there as well, which is that Kanu is lower class, and so that discrepancy, that difference in their station is something that I think also leads Nikhil to believe that he can tell Kanu and not his sister, for example.
It was sort of a beautiful relationship, but I know there's a power differential there too. But yeah. And what about the hair in his ears? that was a great visual that he's always playing with.
Yes, that's just a lovely image.
I mean, it's one of those examples of when someone picks the right image, the whole scene comes alive. And I love that. Okay, so at the very moment that Nikhil asks Sharma to increase their love and have a child, a rare, cool wind comes into the room, and he could hear the rum sellers on the street enunciating prices in a sing-song Urdu. It seems like an invasion of the outside world in that moment. And I thought that was really masterfully done, how everything that was outside comes inside. And he has this, you just sort of viscerally know this isn't going to happen because the world has invaded.
Yeah,
it's very subtle.
That's a beautiful reading of that. Yeah, and certainly was trying to merge between their interior life at that moment and what was happening in the exterior world. And they are also in some ways negotiating with each other as they are entering this moment of intimacy. And so the rum sellers on the street and the sounds that they're making correlates perhaps with the quieter sounds that they're making
Nice.
as they love.
Yeah. Another thing you did that was, I thought, very subtle, but told me a lot. Nikhil notices Sharma's boyish grin and he refers to him as his darling boy. And I thought it was poignant that he referred to his boyish charms at the same time he was asking him to do such an adult thing, like become a parent. And I wondered if the repeated evocation of his boyishness is meant as a harbinger, like perhaps Sharma can't handle parenthood. I don't know. What were you thinking?
I think the use of boy or boyishness indicates that Nikhil believes that Sharma is simply more junior to him in terms of emotional maturity, and I think the story questions that assumption, and so he thinks, oh, this is somebody who's very malleable, and he uses the word malleable
Yes.
with Tripti, and so he generally thinks these are people that I can mold and do with what I please, which he finds is a little more challenging than he expects.
Yeah, and there's a moment, and I don't have this in front of me, but he says that Sharma, he tends to think as slowly as the something as the cow. What was the, I wish I had that one.
The pace the street cows strolled, I believe.
Yeah. But I thought, okay, I bet it's that Sharma is trying to work out in his head. What can I actually tell this person? You know what I mean? Yeah, it's not like he's not thinking slowly. He's
totally. And we are getting this from Nikhil's point of view. So, it may be that Sharma is very measured and deliberate when he's with Nikhil, and then when he's with his friends in the village, where he can really let his hair down, so to speak, that he is just a very different person. And Nikhil, of course, gets a glimpse of that as we talked about when he visits the village. So it's hard to know exactly who Sharma is outside of that relationship.
Right. Yeah, he has to contain himself in so many ways when he's in the relationship. Okay, how about the necklace that he gives, and then it's on the counter? It just doesn't mean as much to Sharma as it does to Nikhil, correct? Like I don't know. I'm curious about that since I have you here.
Yeah, so I think it means something to Sharma from a monetary value perspective, but for Nikhil, it has all of this emotional context that is wrapped up in how he feels about his family history. So even though he has certain feelings about his family when it comes to his sexuality, like I think he feels very proud of his lineage, so to speak, and so the necklace becomes a way that it connects to the wealth of his family, and then also to the British Raj. All around the story are references to colonialism, right?
Yes.
To the effects of colonialism. And so I think Nikhil, like others in India at the time, had a complicated relationship with the British. And I think that comes out in his choice of giving the necklace to Sharma.
Interesting. Can you tell me a little bit more about how that would impact both Nikhil and Sharma differently during that period?
Yes.
Or just in general?
Sure. So when the British ruled India, the folks like Nikhil, who were otherwise middle class, were subservient to the British. So there was a kind of power dynamic that was established that then changed and really sort of dissolved once the British left India. And so then those folks who were subservient to the British suddenly found themselves on top. And the ways in which they could then enact some of those subtle games of oppression became things that they would then do on, their servants or other people. So I think it sort of created a pretty complicated social dynamic where people were repeating some of what they had endured in colonial India.
So I wanted to talk about the last line. Nikhil almost called back, but there was too much distance between them. Whatever he said now wouldn't be heard. It seems pretty clear to me that it's over, right? I don't know. Maybe not. Or maybe he just goes back home and then pretends like it didn't happen.
Yeah. When it comes to endings in general, I like to think of them as the writer providing one beat and then the reader providing the final beat. So I think that ending takes us to the threshold, and then as readers, we kind of complete the story with our own sense of who Nikhil and Sharma and Tripti are. I think that the way I like to think about it is the relationship as we know it has come to an end. What happens after that it could be one of many things. And it could be that he continues to see Sharma, but it's no longer the kind of deep relationship that existed before. It could be that he no longer sees Sharma at all and, asks for his money back. And it could be a number of other possibilities, but I think that their relationship has changed in that moment. It's not going to be the same after that.
Yeah, he's never going to, emotionally, he's not going to trust him as much as he did. He'll have his guard up. He'll have his guard up, even if it continues.
Yes, he will walk away with the scars. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious. So you hadn't graduated, you graduated from Brooklyn College MFA program in 2013. So were you working on this story when you were in school? And I'd be curious to know a little bit about if you workshopped it. And
yes, I did work on an early draft of the story in my MFA, and then I got some feedback. I did some revision, and I submitted it to a public spaces fellowship context, a writing fellows, emerging writers fellows contest. And I was accepted as an emerging writers fellow. And then I worked a little bit more with it as part of the fellowship.
And what were some of the hardest parts for you to capture this particular story?
The hardest thing for me was capturing the cultural nuances. Like we've talked about in this conversation, there are just some things that are difficult to translate for a non-Bengali readers or folks who didn't live in Bengal or didn't know about Bengal in that time period. And so trying to find a way to communicate those without really pandering. That balance, I think, was tricky at times.
Mm-hmm. How long did it take you to write it all together?
It's hard to say. So, I probably was working on it in, I might be getting the dates wrong here a little bit, but 2012, 2013. And then the Public Space Fellowship was 2015. So I probably worked on it over those years. And, I'm putting it down, coming back months later, doing a little edit here and there. Most of the significant edits that I did were shortly after I worked on it in the MFA program. And then after that, it was pretty minor tweaks.
And what was the first, the seed of the story that came to you? Do you remember if it was the characters or the time period or just trying to capture the relationship?
I do. So going back to my grandparents' house in North Calcutta, I was visiting and I was on the roof and I was looking around and seeing how they were in this old, at the time, then old dilapidated building that was really kind of falling apart, but which had once been a really beautiful old house in the sort of British style in which those Kolkata houses were. And I was seeing how everything was sort of changing around them. And I think that's kind of at the heart of the story, which is that Nikhil, even though he's modern and progressive in a certain way, the way in which he loves, he's also very stuck in the past in other ways.
Yes.
And so that kind of like tension was something that I just felt when I was standing on my grandparents' roof. And I started to get the idea for Nikhil at that point, and everything started to fill out as I wrote the first draft.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting writing across like class. I don't know where your family, well, I guess, were they middle class pretty much?
Well, so my maternal grandparents, they were refugees who crossed over to Kolkata with very little money and lived 15 people in a 3-bedroom apartment.
Wow.
And on my father's side, they lived in this, old building, and they were middle class, and so I kind of saw both sides of that world.
That's what I was curious about. I was thinking, like, how did you capture both so well? So what are you working on now? What are you?
Yeah, so I'm always working on short stories. I just have a new one that I've been working on, and then I've got a novel that I'm about 60,000 words into.
One last question. So what's how do you find the difference working on short stories versus the novel?
With a short story, I really want to be able to find a first draft pretty quickly. And oftentimes that first draft is going to be totally messy, chaotic, and I know I'll have to go and revise. But with a novel, I can't do that. So I need to have systems in place to figure out how can I still be connected to this, emotionally connected, and how can I actually track all the information. So with the first draft of the novel, it feels more analytical to me in some ways, even as the writing of the first draft and kind of exploring my subconscious feels very similar as the short story writing, in that I'm kind of like, going through a bit of a mystical process and figuring out what is this inside my brain. So yeah, I mean, I would say that it's really the length and keeping everything together and feeling connected to the work over a long period that feels different.
So that you outline with the novel. I mean, you might go back and try and do an outline, or when you say keep track of it all, I'm just curious what that means.
I don't do outlines. So for my first novel, one of the best pieces of advice that I got was from Michael Cunningham, who said that for a first draft, as you're writing it, only read the last page and a half that you wrote and just keep writing forward until you get to the end. And that was particularly helpful for me because, I would have been in this recursive loop constantly, like editing the first 20 pages or whatever.
Yeah.
With my new novel, I have approached it a little bit differently, which is that I have moved around a lot. So instead of writing it linearly, I have written scenes from different character points of view, from different parts in the novel, and I've been more willing to just sort of jump between time, place, and character than I was when I was writing my first novel.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, it feels much more fun. So this is a way, I suppose, that my sense of process is changing as I continue to explore the craft.
Yeah. Are you the type of writer who would put a story down? Like I talked to Bonnie Jo Campbell for the November 1st podcast, and she was saying there's one story she had that was 24 years old.
Yeah.
But and then she just would keep coming back to it. And so then I asked her, like, when do you know you're done? And I would be curious to have that answer too from you.
Sure. Yes. No, there are stories that I keep in the drawer, and they are like thorns. They keep coming and pricking me at different points, and it'll be months, years later, and I'll come and tweak something and feel like, oh, it's still not right. It's still not ready. And in terms of the question of when is it ready, I think of the poem by Naomi Shihab Nye, which is called How Do You Know When a Poem is Finished? And she talks about this experience of rearranging furniture in a room, and there's only so many times that you can move the blue chair to and move the cushion to another part, and then you realize you've reached like a place of diminishing returns. And And the other way that I like to think about it is that there's a certain point at which I'm no longer spiritually connected to the work. Mm-hmm. And when I'm no longer emotionally connected to the work, I know that, it's time for me to let it go.
Right.
Can't really do much more with it. And then the question is this something from a craft perspective that I am happy to share with the world?
Right. Yeah. When you get that feeling like I've done the best with this I can do.
Yeah. And that I've moved on as a human being, the stories that I was interested in writing 10, 15 years ago are not the same stories I'm interested in writing now.
Right. Right. Well, thank you so much. I don't want to go over our time, but I really appreciate you talking about the story and sharing the process with everyone.
Thank you so much for close reading. I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for joining us on Let's Deconstruct a Story. Please take a moment to sign up for the newsletter at kellyborden.com. We'd love it if you'd like the show or share it on your social media sites. I'd love to hear from you as well about possible guests. And as always, donations are appreciated. Until next month, when I will be talking to Lee Newman about her stupendous story, An Extravaganza in 2 Acts. Happy New Year, everyone.